The music had already started when Elena Voss realized no one was going to save her a seat. She stood at the edge of the grand hall, holding a small clutch bag with both hands, watching hundreds of guests find their places at long tables draped in silver cloth. Candlelight flickered against tall glass windows. Somewhere near the front, her stepmother Vivian Voss was laughing with a circle of important guests, her stepsisters Clara and Marissa on either side of her like matching ornaments. Elena's father, Gerald Voss, sat beside them, adjusting his collar, refusing to meet her eyes. She had known, deep down, that this would happen. She had known it the moment Vivian handed her a seating card that morning, with a tight, satisfied smile. But knowing something and living through it were two very different things. Elena walked toward the table where her family sat, her low heels tapping against the marble floor, each step feeling louder than the last. When she reached the table, she saw it immediately. 6 chairs, 6 place cards. Her name was not among them. "Excuse me," she said quietly to a passing steward. "I believe there's been a mistake. My family is seated here, but I don't see my name." The steward checked his list, his eyes scanning up and down. "I'm sorry, miss. According to this, you've been placed at table 42. Table 42 was near the back of the hall, close to the kitchen doors, where the noise of clattering plates would drown out most conversation. Elena felt her face grow warm, but she kept her expression calm. She had learned a long time ago that giving her stepfamily the reaction they wanted only made things worse. "Thank you," she said, and turned to walk away. "Elena," Vivian called out, her voice syrupy sweet, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "Did you get lost, dear? The back tables are just as lovely, I promise." A few heads turned. Elena felt the heat crawl up her neck, but she only nodded once and kept walking. Clara and Marissa exchanged a glance and a smothered laugh behind their hands. Gerald Voss said nothing at all, which somehow hurt more than anything his wife had said. The unity ceremony was the single most important event in the territories. Once a year, every pack, every bloodline, and every ruling family gathered under one roof to renew old alliances and settle new disputes without conflict. It was said that more decisions were made over this one dinner than in a full year of formal meetings. Standing was everything here. Where you sat, who noticed you, who spoke to you, all of it mattered more than most people wanted to admit. Elena's family held a modest position. Gerald Voss served as beta to a small territory in the Eastern Hills, a role that gave them just enough status to attend the ceremony, but not nearly enough to sit anywhere near the head table. Elena herself held no title at all. She was Gerald's adopted daughter, taken in after her own parents died in a border conflict when she was 7 years old. In the 11 years since, she had never once been allowed to forget that she did not truly belong to the Voss name. She reached table 42 and found it nearly empty, save for 2 elderly guests who barely acknowledged her before returning to their quiet conversation. She sat down, folded her hands in her lap, and stared straight ahead at the enormous hall in front of her, filled with people who did not know her name and did not care to learn it. The head table sat on a raised platform at the far end of the room, elevated so that everyone could see it. Long banners in deep red and gold hung behind it, each one marked with the sigil of a different ruling house. At the very center of that table sat a single empty chair, larger than the rest, carved from dark wood and lined with silver. The Alpha King had not yet arrived. Whispers moved through the crowd like a current. Damian Ashwood ruled over more territory than any leader in living memory. He had taken his throne young, after a war that still made grown men lower their voices when they spoke of it. And in the years since, he had built a reputation that traveled ahead of him wherever he went. Powerful, unshakable, and, according to most who claimed to know him, entirely unreadable. Elena had never seen him in person. She had heard stories, of course. Everyone had. Some called him cold, others called him fair, which in a world built on power, was sometimes the same thing. A hush rolled through the hall as the great doors at the far end opened. Every conversation seemed to drop by half its volume at once. Elena turned in her seat like everyone else, curious despite herself. Damian Ashwood walked into the room alone. He was tall, dressed in a deep charcoal coat that fit him like it had been made for no one else, and he moved with the kind of ease that only came from never once questioning whether a room belonged to him. His dark hair was cut close, his jaw set in a hard, unreadable line, and his eyes swept across the hall once, slowly, as though cataloging every face in it. The crowd rose. Chairs scraped against marble, as guests stood in respect, bowing their heads slightly as he passed. Elena stood too, because everyone else did, though from her position near the back, she doubted he would even glance in her direction. He walked the long aisle toward the head table without pause, without a single word to anyone, until he reached the raised platform. But, instead of taking his seat, he stopped. He turned. His gaze moved across the crowded hall again, this time slower, more deliberate, until it landed somewhere near the back, somewhere near table 42. Elena felt her breath catch. For one absurd moment, she thought perhaps she had imagined it, that his eyes could not possibly be fixed on her, a girl in a plain blue dress, sitting far from anyone who mattered. But he did not look away. If anything, his gaze sharpened, as though he were confirming something to himself. Murmurs rippled through the hall. Vivian's laughter faltered mid-sentence. Elena watched, frozen, as Damian Ashwood stepped down from the platform. He began walking, not toward his own seat, toward hers. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath as he crossed the length of the room, his footsteps unhurried but purposeful, cutting straight through the space between tables. Guests turned in their seats to watch him pass, whispers spreading faster than fire through dry grass. Elena's heart pounded so hard she was certain the people beside her could hear it. He stopped in front of table 42. Up close, he was even more striking than she had expected, and far more intimidating. His eyes, a deep and unusual shade of gray, settled directly on her, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Elena had no idea what to do. Should she bow? Should she say something? She had never been taught how to behave in front of a king who had walked halfway across a room, for reasons she could not begin to guess. "You are seated far from your family," Damian said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," Elena managed, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. "There was a seating arrangement. It isn't important." Something flickered across his face. There, and gone so quickly she almost missed it. He did not smile, but something in his expression softened by the smallest degree. "Come," he said simply, "sit with me." For a moment, Elena thought she had misheard him. The words felt too strange, too impossible, hanging in the air between them. Sit with me. Not a request phrased with the careful politeness people used when speaking to someone below their station, and not a command barked out of arrogance lame. Just two words, quiet and certain, as though there was no other outcome he would accept. Elena glanced past him, toward the head table on its raised platform, toward the hundreds of eyes now fixed on the two of them. "I don't think that's appropriate." I did not ask if it was appropriate," Damian said. His voice was low, even, but there was something underneath it, something steady and unmovable. "I asked you to sit with me." The silence in the hall had become almost unbearable. Elena could feel Vivian's stare burning into the back of her neck from across the room, could imagine Clara and Marissa's stunned faces without even needing to look. She thought of every consequence this moment might carry, every rumor that would spread by morning, every question she would have no good answer for. And yet, some small, foolish part of her did not want to say no. She rose slowly from her seat. Damian did not offer his arm, did not reach for her hand, but he stood beside her, patient and unbothered by the hundreds of eyes locked onto them both, as though this were the most ordinary thing in the world. Together they walked the length of the hall. Elena kept her eyes forward, refusing to look at the faces she passed, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing how badly her hands were shaking. She caught only a glimpse of her stepmother's expression as they passed, pale, furious, and utterly speechless, which was, Elena thought distantly, perhaps the strangest part of the entire evening. She had never once seen Vivian Voss without something clever to say. They reached the raised platform, and Damian gestured toward the empty seat beside his own. A chair Elena was quite certain had never once held anyone but the highest-ranking guests in the territories. She sat, smoothing her dress with hands that refused to stop trembling, painfully aware of every set of eyes still fixed on her. Damien took his own seat beside her and, with a small motion of his hand, signaled for the ceremony to resume. Conversation slowly returned to the hall, though it was quieter now, thinner, carrying an undercurrent of something new. Elena could feel the questions in the air like static before a storm. For several long minutes, neither of them spoke. Elena stared at the plate in front of her, untouched, her appetite entirely gone. She was aware of Damien's presence beside her, in a way she could not quite explain. Not fear, exactly, though there was some of that too, but something else. A kind of attention she had never experienced before, as though for the first time in years, someone in this world had actually seen her. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally, quiet enough that only he could hear. Damien turned his head slightly toward her. "No," he agreed, "I didn't." "Then why did you?" He considered the question for a moment, his gray eyes studying her face in a way that made her want to look away and made her unable to. "Because it was wrong," he said simply. "And because I do not enjoy watching things that are wrong happen in front of me without reason." Elena did not know how to respond to that. She had spent 11 years being told, in ways both loud and quiet, that she did not matter enough to be defended. To have the most powerful man in the territories say otherwise, so plainly, so without hesitation, left her with no words at all. "People will talk," she said instead. "People always talk," Damien said, and for the first time, something almost like amusement touched the corner of his mouth. "It has never once stopped me from doing as I choose." The rest of the ceremony passed in a strange blur for Elena. Course after course was served. Speeches were given by various pack leaders renewing old promises of peace, and through it all, she remained acutely aware of the man seated beside her, of the whispers traveling table to table, like ripples across still water, of her stepmother's eyes finding her again and again from across the hall, sharp and calculating. Near the end of the evening, as guests began to rise and the great hall slowly emptied, Damien rose from his seat as well. He did not offer any explanation for what had happened, did not acknowledge the whispers or the attention, only turned to Elena with the same steady calm he had carried since the moment he crossed the hall to find her. "Thank you for allowing me your company this evening," he said, as though she had been the one doing him a favor, rather than the other way around. "I don't even know why you chose me," Elena admitted, unable to stop the words from slipping out. Something shifted in his expression, something quieter and more careful than before. "Perhaps," he said, "you will understand in time." And then, with a small nod, he turned and walked away, leaving Elena standing alone at the edge of the emptying hall, her heart pounding, her mind spinning with 100 questions she had no answers to. She did not know it yet, but the life she had known until that evening, quiet, overlooked, easily dismissed, had ended the moment the Alpha King crossed the room and asked her to sit beside him. Whatever came next, there would be no going back to the girl who sat alone at table 42, waiting for no one to notice her at all. Outside, the night air was cold and sharp, and Elena walked toward the carriages with her arms wrapped around herself, aware of the stares that followed her the entire way. Vivian caught up to her just before she reached the door, gripping her arm hard enough to bruise. "What did you say to him?" Vivian hissed, her voice low and furious, her polite mask entirely gone now that no one important was close enough to hear. "What did you do?" "Nothing," Elena said, pulling her arm free. "I did nothing. He simply asked me to sit with him." "Kings do not simply do anything," Vivian snapped. "There will be consequences for this, Elena. Mark my words. Nothing good ever comes from drawing that kind of attention." Elena said nothing. She climbed into the carriage alone, since her stepsisters had already claimed the other seats, and pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window as the vehicle pulled away from the grand hall. Behind her, the lights of the ceremony faded into the darkness, but the memory of Damien Ashwood's steady gray eyes, and the two words he had spoken so simply, so certainly, stayed with her the entire ride home. "Sit with me." She did not understand yet what those words would come to mean, or how completely they would reshape the course of her life. But somewhere deep inside her, beneath the confusion and the fear of what her family might do in retaliation, a small, quiet feeling had taken root. For the first time in longer than she could remember, someone had looked at her and decided that she was worth defending. Whatever happened next, Elena thought, staring out at the passing darkness, she would not be going back to being invisible. And though she did not yet know whether that was a blessing or a danger, she suspected she was about to find out. The Voss household was silent the entire ride home, but silence, Elena had learned long ago, was rarely a good sign in that family. It was the kind of quiet that gathered weight, the kind that waited until closed doors before it broke apart into something sharper. She was right to worry. The moment they stepped through the front entrance of their modest estate, Vivian rounded on her, all pretense of composure gone. Gerald followed behind, closing the door with a heavy click, his face tight with an emotion Elena couldn't quite name. Fear, perhaps, or embarrassment. With her father, it was often difficult to tell the difference. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Vivian's voice cracked through the entryway, high and sharp. "Do you understand what people will say about this family now?" "I didn't do anything," Elena said again, though she already knew it wouldn't matter. It never did. He walked over. He asked. "I couldn't very well refuse the Alpha King in front of the entire hall." "You could have declined politely," Clara said from behind her mother, arms crossed, her chin lifted in that particular way she had when she wanted to appear more clever than she was. "You could have said you weren't feeling well." "You wanted this," Marissa added, her tone dripping with accusation. "You've always wanted attention you don't deserve." Elena felt something tighten in her chest, an old, familiar ache she had spent years learning to bury. "I never asked for any of this," she said quietly. "I was simply sitting where I was told to sit." "Enough," Gerald said, though his voice lacked any real authority. He looked between his wife and his adopted daughter with the weary expression of a man who had spent years avoiding conflict rather than solving it. "What's done is done. We need to think carefully about how to handle this." "Handle it?" Vivian repeated, whirling toward him. "Gerald, the Alpha King singled her out in front of every ruling family in the territories. This isn't something we handle. This is something that will define how every pack in this region sees us from now on." "Then perhaps that isn't such a terrible thing," Elena said before she could stop herself. The room went still. Vivian's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Elena thought she might actually strike her. Instead, her stepmother's voice dropped low, cold in a way that was somehow worse than shouting. "You listen to me carefully," Vivian said. "Whatever attention you receive tonight, it has nothing to do with you. Men like Damian Ashwood do not simply notice girls like you. There is a reason behind it, and until we understand what that reason is, you will do nothing to encourage it further. Do you understand me?" Elena did not respond. She turned instead and walked up the stairs to her small room at the end of the hall, closing the door behind her before anyone could say another word. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her own hands in the dim candlelight, replaying the evening over and over. She did not sleep much that night. The following morning brought no relief. Word of what had happened at the ceremony had already begun spreading through the territories, with the kind of speed that only scandal seemed to travel. By midday, a messenger arrived at the Voss estate, carrying a folded letter sealed with a crest Elena did not recognize, though the moment Gerald opened it, his face went pale. "It's from the palace," he said quietly, scanning the words. "An invitation, for Elena, to attend a private council session tomorrow, at the request of the Alpha King." Vivian snatched the letter from his hands, reading it herself with narrowed eyes. "This is not a request," she said. "This is a summons." Elena felt her stomach twist with a mixture of dread and something else she refused to name. "What does he want from me?" "I don't know," Vivian said, and for once, her voice held no anger, only a kind of wary calculation. "But you will go, and you will be careful. There are people in that court who will not welcome an outsider gaining the king's favor, no matter how it happened." The palace, when Elena arrived the next day, was nothing like she had imagined. It rose from the hillside like something carved from the mountain itself, all dark stone and towering windows, surrounded by grounds so vast she could not see where they ended. A guard escorted her through long corridors lined with portraits of past rulers, each one more severe than the last, until she reached a set of heavy wooden doors that opened into a private council chamber. Damien was already there, seated at the head of a long table, along with several advisors she did not recognize. He rose slightly as she entered, a small gesture of respect that seemed to unsettle the men around him more than it did her. "Elena," he said, "thank you for coming." "I wasn't given much choice," she admitted, and immediately regretted the boldness of it. But Damien did not seem offended. If anything, something like approval flickered across his expression. "No," he agreed. "I suppose you weren't." One of the advisors, an older man with sharp eyes and a thin mouth, cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, perhaps it would be wiser to discuss matters of security in private, without—" He paused, glancing at Elena with poorly disguised disdain. "Outside guests present." "Elena is not an outside guest, Alistair," Damien said, his voice carrying an edge that made the advisor fall silent immediately. "She is present because there was an incident during the ceremony that concerns her directly, and I intend for her to hear it from me, not from rumor." Elena's pulse quickened. "An incident?" Damien gestured for her to sit, and she did, lowering herself carefully into the chair nearest him, while the advisors around the table exchanged uneasy glances. "During the closing hour of the ceremony," Damien said, "one of the guards discovered a disturbance near the eastern courtyard. A member of the household staff, someone who should not have had access to that area, was found attempting to enter the private quarters where several guests, including your family, were staying for the night." "Was anyone hurt?" Elena asked immediately. "No," Damien said. "The guard intervened before anything could happen, but the individual has not yet been identified, and given the timing, so soon after the events at dinner, I am not willing to dismiss the possibility that it was connected to the attention you received." Elena felt a chill settle over her. "You think someone wanted to hurt me? Because you asked me to sit with you?" "I think," Damien said carefully, "that there are those in this territory who do not welcome unpredictability, and last night's events were, without question, unpredictable. Until we know more, I would prefer you remain close to the palace, where I can ensure your safety." The advisor named Alistair made a small, disapproving sound low in his throat, though he said nothing aloud. Elena noticed the way his eyes lingered on her, calculating, cold, and she found herself wondering, not for the first time, exactly how many people in this room resented her presence simply for existing in it. "I can't just stay at the palace," Elena said. "My family." "Your family," Damien interrupted, not unkindly, but firmly enough that she stopped speaking, "left you sitting alone at a table, while claiming close standing among royalty. Forgive me, if I do not consider their opinion on this matter to carry much weight." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, though this time it was not entirely from embarrassment. There was something oddly freeing about hearing someone say aloud what she had known privately for years, something she had never once been allowed to acknowledge in her own home. "I still don't understand why any of this concerns you," she said quietly. "You don't know me. Whatever happened last night, whatever this threat might be, it isn't your responsibility." Damien was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes studying her with an intensity that made it difficult for her to hold his gaze. "Perhaps not," he said finally, "but I have made it my responsibility regardless. You may disagree with that decision if you wish. It will not change my mind." The council session continued for another hour, discussing matters of increased security around the palace grounds, and quiet inquiries into the identity of the intruder from the night before. Elena listened carefully, though much of the conversation moved quickly between topics she did not fully understand, referencing territories and alliances, and old conflicts she had only ever heard about in passing. When the meeting finally ended, and the advisors filed out of the room, Alistair lingered behind, just long enough to fix Elena with one final look, sharp and unreadable, before following the others through the heavy doors. Elena did not know what to make of it, only that it left an uneasy feeling settled deep in her stomach. "You shouldn't concern yourself with Alistair," Damien said once they were alone, as though he had read the thought directly from her expression. "He is cautious by nature. It serves him well in his position, though it does occasionally make him difficult." "He doesn't trust me," Elena said. "He doesn't trust anyone," Damien corrected. "It has little to do with you specifically." Elena wasn't entirely convinced, but she said nothing further on the matter. Instead, she looked around the empty council chamber, at the tall windows overlooking the palace grounds, at the weight of history pressing down from every portrait and banner in the room, and felt suddenly very small and very far from the life she had known only 2 days earlier. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Damien said, rising from his seat, "I would like to show you something, if you're willing." He led her from the council chamber through a series of quieter corridors, away from the formal halls, and toward a part of the palace that felt distinctly less grand, more lived in. Eventually, they reached a set of doors that opened onto a private garden, enclosed on all sides by high stone walls, filled with flowering trees and a quiet fountain at its center. "This was my mother's garden," Damien said, stepping onto the gravel path. "She passed when I was young. My father had little use for gardens after that, so it has mostly gone untouched for years, save for what the groundskeepers manage on their own." Elena walked beside him slowly, taking in the quiet beauty of the space, so different from the imposing grandeur of the rest of the palace. "It's peaceful here," she said. "It's one of the few places in this palace that is," Damien admitted. There was something different in his voice now, something less guarded than before. "I find myself here more often than I probably should, given everything else that requires my attention." "Why did you bring me here?" Elena asked. Damien was quiet for a moment, watching the water ripple gently in the fountain. "Because I wanted you to see something true about me," he said finally, "before you decided whether to trust anything I say. Titles and thrones tell you very little about a person. I thought this might tell you more." Elena studied him carefully, this man who ruled over more territory and more lives than she could fully comprehend, standing quietly in his late mother's garden, with an expression she had not yet seen on him, something almost vulnerable, something entirely human. "Thank you," she said softly, "for showing me." They stood together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the weight of the previous night's chaos fading, if only briefly, into something gentler. Elena did not know what the coming days would bring, whether the threat Damien had mentioned would resurface, or how her family would react to her extended stay at the palace. But standing in that quiet garden, she found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, unafraid of what came next. Whatever this was becoming, whatever strange and unexpected path had opened in front of her, Elena decided she would face it honestly, rather than retreat back into the shadows where she had spent so many years hiding. The king had chosen to see her. Now, it seemed, it was her turn to decide what she wanted to see in return. 3 days passed before Elena fully understood what it meant to live inside palace walls. She had been given a suite of rooms in the eastern wing, far grander than anything she had ever known, with tall windows overlooking the very garden where she and Damien had stood together that first afternoon. A member of the household staff, a warm and quietly efficient woman named Margaret, had been assigned to assist her, though Elena found herself far more comfortable dressing and managing her own affairs than she was accepting help she felt she hadn't earned. "You'll grow used to it," Margaret told her one morning, folding fresh linens with practiced hands. "Most who come from smaller households do, eventually. Though I'll admit, you seem far less interested in the comforts than most guests who stay here." "I'm not sure I'm meant to be comfortable," Elena admitted. "I still don't fully understand why I'm here at all." Margaret gave her a knowing look, the kind that suggested she understood a great deal more than she was willing to say. "The king doesn't often bring guests to stay in the family wing," she said simply. "Make of that what you will." Elena thought about those words often over the following days, turning them over in her mind during quiet moments between the small routines that had begun to shape her new life. She took her meals most evenings with Damien, not in the grand dining hall where formal court dinners were held, but in a smaller private room just off his study, where conversation felt easier, less performative. It was during one such evening, several days into her stay, that Damien first spoke of his own past. "You asked me once why I concerned myself with what happened to you," he said, turning his glass slowly between his fingers, his gaze fixed somewhere in the middle distance. "I don't believe I ever gave you a full answer." Elena set down her fork, giving him her full attention. "You don't have to explain yourself to me." "I know," Damien said, "but I find that I want to." He was quiet for a long moment, and Elena waited, sensing that whatever he was about to share was not something he offered easily or often. "My father ruled before me," he began. Harsh, calculating, and utterly without patience for weakness, real or perceived. I was his second son. My older brother, Edwin, was groomed from birth to inherit the throne. I was largely an afterthought, tolerated more than valued, expected to serve my brother's future rule, rather than pursue any ambitions of my own. "What happened to him?" Elena asked gently. "Your brother." "He died," Damien said simply, "during a border conflict when I was 17. And overnight, everything my father had built around Edwin's future was suddenly mine to inherit instead, whether I was prepared for it or not." He paused, his jaw tightening slightly. My father made his disappointment in that outcome very clear. He spent the following years attempting to reshape me into someone more suited to his vision of a ruler. Someone harder, colder, less inclined toward sentiment of any kind. "That sounds lonely," Elena said quietly. "It was," Damien admitted, meeting her eyes for the first time since he'd begun speaking. "I understood, even then, what it felt like to sit in a room full of people who considered you an obligation, rather than someone worth genuine regard. I understood what it felt like to be reminded, again and again, that you did not quite belong where you had been placed." His gaze softened. "When I saw you at that ceremony, sitting alone while your family sat comfortably near the front, I recognized something in it. I could not simply watch and do nothing." Elena felt something tighten in her chest, a complicated mixture of sympathy and understanding she hadn't expected to feel so strongly. "I'm sorry," she said, "for what you went through." "Don't be," Damien said. "It shaped the ruler I became, for better or worse. I only tell you this so you understand my reasons were never about you owing me anything, nor about some passing curiosity. I saw something familiar, and I chose not to look away from it." The conversation shifted after that, moving into gentler territory, and Elena found herself laughing for the first time in longer than she could remember, genuinely and without restraint, at some dry observation Damien made about one of his more long-winded advisors. It struck her, in that moment, how easy it had become to simply exist beside him, without performance, without the constant careful calculation she had spent years applying to every interaction within her own household. It was not until later that week that the fragile peace of those quiet evenings began to crack. Elena had been walking back from the library, a large collection housed in the palace's western wing, when she overheard two voices speaking in low tones just around the corner of an adjoining corridor. She recognized one of them immediately as Alistair, the advisor who had made no secret of his distrust toward her. "Cannot continue allowing this," Alistair was saying, his voice tight with frustration. "The court is already speaking of nothing else. An unknown girl, without title, without lineage of any real consequence, seated at the king's side as though she belongs there. It undermines everything we've worked to stabilize since the war." "The king seems quite settled in his decision," a second voice replied, smoother, almost amused. Elena did not recognize this voice at all. Perhaps it would be wiser to focus our energy elsewhere, rather than fighting a battle His Majesty has already decided. "There are other ways to handle a problem than direct confrontation," Alistair said, his tone dropping lower still. "If the girl proves to be a liability, a risk to his judgment, his reputation, his safety, the king will remove her from his side himself. We need only ensure he sees the truth of the matter clearly." Elena's blood ran cold. She pressed herself carefully against the wall, straining to hear more, but the voices had already begun moving away, their footsteps fading into the distance before she could catch anything further. She stood frozen in the corridor for several long moments, her heart pounding, turning the conversation over in her mind. There are other ways to handle a problem. The words settled uneasily in her stomach, heavy with implications she did not fully want to examine. She considered telling Damien immediately, but something held her back. What if she had misunderstood the context? What if bringing unfounded suspicion against one of his most trusted advisors only made her seem exactly as troublesome as Alistair already believed her to be? She decided, reluctantly, to wait, to watch carefully, and to gather more before saying anything at all. Over the following days, Elena found herself paying closer attention to the currents moving beneath the surface of palace life. She noticed the way certain members of court watched her when they thought she wasn't looking, the way conversations sometimes fell quiet when she entered a room, the careful, practiced smiles that never quite reached anyone's eyes. It was, she realized, not so different from her own household, only the stakes here were immeasurably higher. She mentioned none of this to Damien directly, not wanting to burden him with suspicions she could not yet prove, but she found herself growing more cautious, more observant, storing away small details that felt important even when she couldn't yet see how they connected. It was during a formal gathering nearly 2 weeks after her arrival, a smaller court dinner, meant to welcome a visiting delegation from a neighboring territory, that the tension finally came to a head. Elena had been seated beside Damien once again, a placement that had become expected rather than shocking in the weeks since the ceremony, though it still drew glances from certain corners of the room. Partway through the meal, a member of the visiting delegation, a sharp-eyed woman, introduced as Isabel Frost, leaned across the table with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Tell me," Isabel said, addressing Elena directly for the first time that evening, "how does it feel, being elevated so quickly to such a position? It must be rather overwhelming, coming from such humble beginnings." The comment landed with deliberate precision, cutting just sharp enough to sting without crossing into open rudeness. Elena felt several eyes at the table turned toward her, waiting to see how she would respond. "It has certainly been an adjustment," Elena said carefully, keeping her voice even, "though I've found the palace far more welcoming than I expected." "How fortunate," Isabel said, her smile widening slightly. "Though I imagine some might find it curious, how quickly a girl with no family standing, no political connections, and no formal education in court matters has found herself so close to the throne. One might almost call it suspicious, don't you think?" The table fell quiet. Damien's expression hardened beside her, though before he could respond, Elena spoke first, her voice steady, despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "I understand the curiosity," she said. "It is unusual, I agree, but I would gently suggest that questioning someone's worth based on their birth, rather than their character, is a rather old-fashioned way of measuring value. I would hope this court has grown beyond such thinking by now." A ripple of quiet amusement moved through several guests at the table, and Isabel's smile faltered, just slightly, before she recovered it with practiced ease. "Well said," she replied smoothly, though her eyes carried none of the warmth her words suggested. Beside Elena, Damien said nothing, but she felt his hand find hers briefly beneath the table, a small, steady gesture of support that told her more than words could have. The rest of the dinner passed without further incident, though Elena noticed Isabel exchange a brief, knowing glance with Alistair from across the room, one that left an uneasy weight settling in her chest. Later that night, walking together through the quiet garden after the guests had departed, Elena finally allowed herself to voice some of what had been building inside her for days. "I overheard something," she admitted. "Alistair, speaking with someone I didn't recognize, they were discussing me, discussing ways to handle the problem, I suppose, that I represent." Damien's expression darkened immediately. "When did this happen?" "Nearly 2 weeks ago," Elena said. "I wasn't certain it meant anything at the time. I didn't want to accuse someone without real evidence." "You should have told me sooner," Damien said, though his tone carried more concern than anger. "I know," Elena admitted. "I'm telling you now." Damien was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed somewhere in the darkness beyond the garden walls. "Alistair has served my family for many years," he said finally. "He is cautious, sometimes to a fault, but I have never known him to act with true malice. Still, I will not dismiss what you've told me. I will watch him more carefully from here forward." "And Isabel?" Elena asked. Tonight at dinner, they looked at each other in a way that felt deliberate. "Isabel Frost represents a territory that has long sought greater influence within this court," Damien said. "It would not surprise me if she saw an opportunity in tonight's dinner, testing how far she might push before consequences followed. I will make certain she understands there will be consequences, should she attempt it again." Elena nodded, though the uneasy feeling in her chest did not entirely fade. She looked up at Damien, at the quiet determination in his expression, and felt a complicated mixture of gratitude and worry settle over her. "I don't want to become a burden to you," she said softly. "A liability, the way Alistair suggested." Damien turned to face her fully, his gray eyes steady and certain. "You are not a burden, Elena," he said, "and you never will be. Whatever comes next, whatever schemes are being whispered in dark corridors, we will face them together. That is not a promise I make lightly." Elena wanted, desperately, to believe him entirely, and in that quiet garden, beneath a sky full of distant stars, she allowed herself, if only for a moment, to set aside her fear and simply trust in the steady certainty of his words. But even as she did, some quiet, cautious part of her recognized that whatever plans were being made in the shadows of the palace, they had only just begun. The weeks that followed brought a strange sort of rhythm to Elena's new life, one she found herself settling into more comfortably than she had expected. Mornings were spent with Margaret, learning the small formalities of court life she had never needed before, from proper greetings for visiting dignitaries to the subtle language of seating arrangements and gift exchanges. Afternoons were often hers to fill as she wished, and she found herself drawn again and again to the quiet garden or to the palace library, where she lost herself for hours among books on the history of the territories. Evenings, more often than not, belonged to Damien. Their private dinners had become something Elena looked forward to more than she was entirely comfortable admitting, even to herself. There was an ease that had grown between them, a quiet familiarity built from small moments rather than grand declarations. Damien, she had learned, possessed a dry sense of humor he rarely showed in public, and a genuine curiosity about her opinions that no one in her own household had ever bothered to seek out. But beneath the growing warmth of those private hours, the tension Elena had first sensed weeks earlier had not disappeared. If anything, it had only grown quieter, more careful, more difficult to pin down to any single moment or conversation. She noticed it in small things. A guard she did not recognize, stationed unusually close to her private rooms one evening, who claimed to have simply lost his way when she asked. A letter she had written to a former neighbor back home, meant to reassure the woman of her safety, that arrived weeks later than it should have, its seal slightly disturbed. Whispers among the household staff that quieted whenever she entered a room, though Margaret, at least, remained steadily kind and unchanged. Elena mentioned these small oddities to Damien when they arose, and each time, he took them seriously, ordering quiet investigations that turned up little of substance. It left her feeling, more than anything, as though she were chasing shadows that dissolved the moment she reached for them. The true crisis arrived nearly a month after her arrival at the palace, on an evening that had, until that point, seemed entirely ordinary. Elena had been walking back from the library later than usual, a book on regional history tucked beneath her arm, when she noticed a folded piece of parchment tucked half beneath her door. She frowned, picking it up carefully, unfolding it as she stepped into her room. The handwriting was unfamiliar, hurried and slightly uneven, as though written quickly and without care for neatness. "Meet me in the eastern courtyard at midnight," it read. "I have information regarding a threat to the king's safety that you must hear directly. Come alone, tell no one, until you understand the full nature of what is happening." Elena read the note twice, her pulse quickening. Every instinct told her this was unwise, that she should bring it directly to Damien, or to the palace guard, rather than acting alone. But the note's warning, "Tell no one," combined with her memory of the conversation she had overheard between Alistair and the unknown voice weeks earlier, left her uncertain of exactly who within the palace could truly be trusted. Against her better judgment, curiosity and concern for Damien's safety won out over caution. She waited until the palace had gone mostly quiet, the household staff retired for the evening, before slipping out of her room and making her way carefully through the darkened corridors toward the eastern courtyard. The night air was cold and still, as she stepped outside, the courtyard empty and silent beneath a sky heavy with clouds. She waited, her arms wrapped around herself against the chill, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. "I wondered if you would actually come." Elena spun around at the sound of the voice, her heart lurching, as Isabel Frost stepped out from behind a stone pillar, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "You wrote the note," Elena said, understanding dawning slowly, unpleasantly. I did, Isabel admitted, unbothered. Though I confess, the message wasn't entirely honest. There is no threat to the king's safety, not from outside these walls at least. Elena's stomach twisted with sudden, sharp unease. What is this, then? An opportunity, Isabel said, stepping closer, her voice smooth and unhurried, for you to see clearly what your presence here has cost, before matters progress any further than they already have. Before Elena could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps and raised voices reached them from the palace entrance behind her. She turned, confused, just in time to see several palace guards emerge into the courtyard, torches raised, expressions grim. There, one of the guards called out. Just as we were told. Elena's confusion turned rapidly to alarm as the guards approached, their attention fixed squarely on her, not on Isabel, who had already begun retreating quietly into the shadows with the practiced ease of someone who had planned her exit long before the confrontation began. Elena Voss, the lead guard said, his tone formal and cold. You are to come with us immediately. There has been a serious accusation made against you. An accusation? Elena's voice rose with disbelief. Of what? Conspiring against the crown, the guard replied. A letter was discovered this evening, in your handwriting, arranging a secret meeting with a known agent from a rival territory, discussing details that compromise the king's security. That's not, I didn't write any such letter, Elena said, her heart pounding painfully against her ribs. The note I received tonight said nothing of the kind. I came here believing there was a genuine threat to the king's safety. That is not what the evidence suggests, the guard said, though something in his expression suggested even he found the accusation difficult to fully believe. You will need to explain yourself to the council, immediately. Elena's mind raced as the guards escorted her back into the palace, her thoughts spinning through everything that had just happened. Isabel had orchestrated this deliberately, luring her into the courtyard under false pretenses, then vanishing the moment the guards arrived, leaving Elena alone to face accusations she had no way to immediately disprove. She was brought before the council chamber, the same room where she had first learned of the intruder weeks earlier, though this time the atmosphere carried none of the cautious civility from before. Several advisors were already gathered, including Alistair, whose expression carried an unmistakable note of grim satisfaction he did little to hide. Damien arrived only minutes later, his expression stormy, his eyes finding Elena immediately across the room. What is the meaning of this? He demanded, his voice carrying an edge Elena had not heard from him before. Your Majesty, Alistair said, stepping forward with a folded letter in hand. This was discovered in the eastern courtyard less than an hour ago, alongside witness testimony, placing Miss Voss at a secret meeting with a known operative from a territory that has, historically, shown hostile intent toward this crown. He handed the letter to Damien, who read it slowly, his jaw tightening with each line. Elena watched, her heart sinking, as his expression shifted from anger toward something more complicated, more uncertain. This is my handwriting, Elena said, stepping forward despite the guard's attempt to hold her back. Or something close enough to fool anyone who doesn't know me well. But I did not write this letter. I received a different note tonight, one warning me of a threat against your safety, urging me to meet secretly and tell no one. I went to protect you, not to conspire against you. Do you have this note? Alistair asked, his tone carrying poorly concealed skepticism. Elena reached into the pocket of her dress, her fingers closing around empty fabric. Her stomach dropped. I had it, she said, her voice faltering. I must have dropped it. In the courtyard when the guards arrived. A heavy silence settled over the room. Elena could see, in the faces around her, exactly how this appeared. A convenient story, entirely unverifiable, offered only after being caught in what looked increasingly like a genuine conspiracy. Your Majesty, Alistair said carefully, I understand this is a difficult matter, given your personal regard for Miss Voss. But the evidence, taken together, paints a troubling picture. I would strongly recommend a formal investigation, conducted with full transparency, before any further decisions are made regarding her place within these walls. Damien was quiet for a long moment, the letter still held tightly in his hand, his eyes moving between the parchment and Elena's face, searching for something Elena couldn't quite name. She held his gaze steadily, refusing to look away, refusing to let the fear building inside her show any weakness that might be misread as guilt. "I did not do this," she said quietly. "Just for him. You know me well enough by now to understand that much, even if you can't yet prove it." For a long, agonizing moment, Damien said nothing at all. And in the silence, Elena felt the full weight of everything that had brought her to this room, the careful trust they had built over weeks of quiet dinners and honest conversation, now hanging entirely in the balance, threatened by a conspiracy she had walked into with her eyes wide open and still failed to see coming until it was far too late. "There will be an investigation," Damien said finally, his voice carefully controlled, though Elena could hear the tension threaded through every word. "A full and fair one. Elena will remain within the palace during this process, under guard, but she will not be treated as a prisoner." "Is that understood?" "Your Majesty," Alistair began, "given the severity of the accusation, perhaps a more secure arrangement would be—" "I said guarded," Damien repeated, his tone leaving no room for further argument. "Not imprisoned. She will retain her rooms in the eastern wing. 2 guards will be posted outside at all times, for her protection as much as anything else, until we determine who is truly responsible for tonight's events." Elena felt a small measure of relief at his words, though it did little to ease the tight knot of fear still lodged in her chest. Whatever trust remained between them, it was clear that even Damien could not simply dismiss the accusation outright, not with an entire council watching for any sign of favoritism that might weaken his authority. The following days passed in a haze of quiet dread. Elena remained largely confined to her rooms, save for brief walks in the garden under careful watch, while the palace guard conducted their investigation. She saw little of Damien during this time, though she understood, rationally, that he was likely occupied managing the political fallout of the accusation, meeting with advisors, attempting to separate truth from the carefully constructed lies Isabel had left in her wake. Word of the accusation, inevitably, reached her family. Vivian arrived at the palace on the 3rd day, requesting an audience that Elena had little power to refuse. Her stepmother swept into the small sitting room where Elena had been permitted to receive visitors, her expression carrying none of the fury Elena had expected, but something colder instead, something far more calculating. "I've heard what's happened," Vivian said, without preamble, taking a seat across from Elena with careful precision. "Conspiracy against the crown. Do you have any idea what this means for this family's standing? Elena, for your father's position?" "I didn't do anything," Elena said, exhausted by how many times she had already repeated those same words to people who seemed determined not to believe them. "I was deceived, deliberately, by someone who wanted to see me removed from the palace." "Whether that's true or not hardly matters now," Vivian said, her voice sharp and businesslike. "What matters is how this reflects on us. Your father has already received inquiries from several allied families, questioning whether our household can be trusted, given our connection to you. So that's why you've come," Elena said quietly, understanding settling over her like a cold weight. "Not because you're concerned for my well-being, because you're concerned for your reputation." Vivian's expression did not soften. "I came," she said, "to inform you that until this matter is fully resolved and your name is entirely cleared, it would be best if you did not use the Voss name in any official capacity. Your father agrees. We cannot afford to be associated with an unresolved scandal of this magnitude." Elena felt something inside her go still and quiet, a familiar ache that had followed her for as long as she could remember, though this time it carried less surprise than it once might have. "You're disowning me," she said simply. "Again." "I would not phrase it so dramatically," Vivian said, rising from her seat with the same brisk efficiency she had entered with. "Consider it a temporary distancing, until circumstances improve. Should you be cleared of these accusations, and should the king's regard for you prove lasting, I imagine our family would be quite willing to reconsider our position." "Of course you would," Elena said softly, more to herself than to Vivian. Her stepmother left without another word, and Elena sat alone in the quiet sitting room for a long while afterward, staring at the closed door, feeling the full weight of exactly how alone she truly was within these palace walls. Whatever bond she had once imagined existed between herself and the family that raised her, it had never been strong enough to survive the first real test it faced. She wondered, not for the first time, whether it had ever truly existed at all. That evening, Damien came to see her, the first time she had seen him since the night of the accusation. He looked tired, the weight of the past several days visible in the tension around his eyes, though his expression softened slightly the moment he saw her. "I heard your stepmother visited," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "She wanted to make certain I understood I was no longer welcome to use her family's name," Elena said, keeping her voice steady despite the ache still lingering beneath her ribs. "Until my name is cleared at least, assuming it ever is." Something dark passed across Damien's expression. "It will be cleared," he said firmly. "The investigation has already uncovered several inconsistencies in the evidence presented against you. The letter itself does not entirely match your handwriting, once examined closely by someone trained to notice such details. And a member of the kitchen staff reported seeing Isabel Frost near your quarters earlier that same evening, though she claims she was simply lost." Elena felt a small flicker of hope kindle in her chest, though she was careful not to let it grow too quickly. "Do you believe her? Isabel, I mean. Do you believe she's behind this?" "I believe," Damien said carefully, "that the evidence increasingly points toward her involvement, though I am not yet willing to act on suspicion alone. I have learned, over the years, that acting too quickly, without absolute certainty, often causes more damage than patience ever could." Elena nodded, though the uncertainty of waiting weighed heavily on her all the same. "And if it is her," she asked, "what happens then?" "Then," Damien said, his voice hardening slightly, "she will answer for what she has done, and for whatever role Alistair may have played in encouraging it. I do not take kindly to those who use deception to threaten someone under my protection." Elena studied him carefully, searching his expression for any sign of the doubt she had seen in his eyes that first night in the council chamber, when the accusation had first been laid before him. She found none, only steady, unwavering resolve. "You believed me," she said quietly. "Even then, even with the evidence against me." "I did," Damien confirmed. "It took me longer than it should have to say so aloud, and for that, I am sorry. But I never truly doubted you, Elena, not in the way that mattered." The words settled over her like warmth after a long, cold stretch of uncertainty. She reached out, hesitantly, and took his hand, feeling the steady strength of his fingers curl around hers in response. "Thank you," she said, "for not giving up on me, even when it might have been easier." "Nothing about this has ever felt easy," Damien said, a small, tired smile touching the corner of his mouth. "But some things are worth the difficulty regardless." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the quiet warmth between them, a small refuge against the storm still gathering outside these walls. But, even as Elena allowed herself a fragile measure of hope, she understood that the true confrontation, the moment that would determine whether Isabel's scheme succeeded or crumbled entirely, still lay ahead of them, drawing closer with each passing day. The break in the investigation came nearly a week later, arriving in a form none of them had fully anticipated. Margaret, the quiet, steady woman who had cared for Elena's room since her arrival at the palace, requested an urgent audience with Damien one evening, insisting the matter could not wait until morning. Elena was summoned to the council chamber alongside him, uncertain what news could possibly warrant such urgency, though the anxious set of Margaret's shoulders told her it was serious. "Your Majesty," Margaret said, wringing her hands slightly as she stood before them both. "I should have come forward sooner, and I apologize for my hesitation. I was frightened of the consequences, given who is involved." "Tell me what you know," Damien said gently, though his tone carried an unmistakable urgency of its own. "I overheard a conversation," Margaret said, "nearly 2 weeks ago, between Lady Isabel Frost and advisor Alistair. I did not think much of it at the time, only that it seemed unusual for the two of them to be speaking so privately. But given everything that has happened since, I believe it may be relevant." "What did you hear?" Elena asked, her pulse quickening. "They discussed a letter," Margaret said. "Isabel mentioned needing a sample of Miss Voss's handwriting, something from her personal correspondence, to have properly copied by someone skilled in such matters. Alistair agreed to help arrange it discreetly, mentioning a contact who owed him a favor from years past. Elena's breath caught. "The letter I sent, weeks ago, to my former neighbor," she said slowly, understanding dawning with sickening clarity. "It arrived late, and the seal looked disturbed when it finally reached her. Someone must have intercepted it, copied my handwriting from it, before allowing it to continue on its way." Damien's expression had gone hard and cold, a fury Elena had not yet seen from him settling into every line of his face. "Why did you not come forward with this sooner?" he asked Margaret, though his tone remained carefully controlled. "I was afraid, Your Majesty," Margaret admitted. "Advisor Alistair holds considerable influence within this court. I worried that speaking against him, without more certain proof, would cost me my position, or worse. It was only after I learned Miss Voss had been formally accused that I understood I could no longer stay silent, regardless of the risk to myself." "You will not face any consequence for coming forward now," Damien said firmly. "You have my word on that." "Thank you, Margaret. This information may prove decisive." After Margaret departed, Damien turned to Elena, his expression grim but resolute. "This is enough to bring both Isabel and Alistair before formal questioning," he said. "Combined with the kitchen staff's testimony placing Isabel near your quarters, and the inconsistencies already found in the letter's handwriting, I believe we finally have what we need to expose the truth of this conspiracy." The confrontation took place the following morning, in the same council chamber where Elena had first been accused. Isabel arrived with her usual composed elegance, though something flickered briefly across her expression when she saw Margaret seated quietly near the back of the room. Alistair's face had gone pale the moment he entered, and understood the gathering was not the routine council meeting he had likely expected. "You stand accused," Damien said, his voice carrying easily across the silent chamber, "of conspiring to forge evidence against Elena Voss, with the intent of having her removed from this palace through false accusations of treason against the crown." "This is absurd," Isabel said smoothly, though Elena noticed a slight tightening around her eyes that suggested the composure was more effort than ease. "I have no idea what evidence you believe supports such a claim. A member of the household staff overheard you and Advisor Alistair discussing the acquisition of a handwriting sample belonging to Miss Voss, weeks before the accusation was made," Damien said. "That same staff member has confirmed intercepting and delaying a personal letter sent by Miss Voss during that same period, its seal disturbed upon eventual delivery. Additionally, kitchen staff have confirmed your presence near Miss Voss's private quarters on the night in question, despite your claim of having simply lost your way." Isabel's expression finally cracked, just slightly, though she recovered quickly, her chin lifting with defiant pride rather than shame. "Even if any of that were true," she said, "you cannot deny that a girl with no title, no lineage, no true claim to influence within this court, has no business sitting at your side. Your Majesty, I did what I believed necessary to protect the stability of this territory." "You did what you believed necessary to protect your own ambitions," Damien said coldly. "Your territory has sought greater influence within this court for years. Isabel, Elena's presence threatened nothing but your own calculations regarding how that influence might be gained." He turned his attention next to Alistair, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, his face ashen. "And you," Damien said, his voice hardening further, "years of service to this crown, and you chose to involve yourself in a scheme built entirely on deception and forged evidence, rather than bringing your concerns to me directly." "Your Majesty," Alistair said, his voice unsteady, "I believed I was protecting the crown from a situation that had grown genuinely unpredictable. I did not fully understand the extent of what Lady Frost intended when I agreed to assist her." "Ignorance is not innocence," Damien said. "You will both face formal consequences for what has been done here. Isabel Frost, you are to be escorted from these grounds immediately, and formal correspondence will be sent to your territory's leadership regarding this conspiracy, along with appropriate diplomatic consequences. Alistair, you are relieved of your position as advisor to this court, effective immediately, though given your years of prior service, I will not pursue further punishment beyond this dismissal." The chamber fell into stunned silence as the full weight of Damien's judgment settled over the room. Isabel's composed mask had fully fallen away now, replaced by something sharper, more resentful. though she said nothing further, as palace guards moved to escort her from the room. Alistair simply lowered his head, the weight of his own choices finally settling fully upon him, and followed the guards without protest. Once the chamber had emptied, leaving only Elena and Damien standing together in the quiet aftermath, Elena felt the full weight of the past several weeks finally begin to lift from her shoulders. "It's over," she said softly, still hardly able to believe it. "My name is finally cleared." "It is," Damien confirmed, turning to face her fully, "and I am deeply sorry it took as long as it did. You should never have had to endure any of this." "You believed me," Elena said, "even when the evidence made it difficult. That mattered more than you probably realize." Damien reached out, gently taking her hands in his own, his gray eyes steady and warm, in a way that made Elena's heart ache with something she was only beginning to fully understand. "I meant what I told you, weeks ago, in the garden," he said. "Whatever came next, we would face it together. I do not make promises I don't intend to keep." Elena felt tears gather unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, though for the first time in longer than she could remember, they were not tears of sorrow or fear, but something closer to relief, and perhaps, if she allowed herself to name it honestly, something closer to hope. The conspiracy that had threatened to unravel everything had finally been exposed, the truth laid bare before the entire court. But as Elena stood there, her hands held gently in Damien's, she understood that the ending of one difficult chapter did not mean the story itself had reached its conclusion. There was still the matter of what came next, of what she truly wanted her life to become, now that the shadow of false accusation no longer hung over her. And for the first time since she had first stepped through the palace doors, Elena found she was genuinely eager to discover the answer. Word of the conspiracy's exposure spread through the territories almost as quickly as the rumors that had first surrounded Elena's arrival at the palace, though this time, the story carried a different weight entirely. Where once she had been whispered about as an outsider who had somehow captured the king's fleeting attention, she was now spoken of, cautiously at first, and then with growing genuine respect, as a woman who had withstood a deliberate attempt to destroy her reputation, and had emerged from it with her integrity fully intact. Isabel Frost's territory sent formal apologies to the crown within the month, along with quiet assurances that she would face consequences within her own household for the diplomatic embarrassment her actions had caused. Alistair, stripped of his position, retreated from public life entirely, his years of service ending not with honor, but with the quiet shame of having let ambition and misplaced loyalty guide him toward choices he could not undo. For Elena, the weeks following the conspiracy's collapse brought a kind of peace she had never before experienced. She remained at the palace, no longer confined to her rooms under careful guard, but free to move through the grounds and gardens as she pleased, her name cleared, her place within the court no longer a matter of quiet speculation, but of open acknowledgement. She did not hear from her family again during this time, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that their silence no longer carried the sharp sting it once might have. She had spent so many years believing that her worth was tied to their approval, to earning a place within a household that had never truly wanted her there. It had taken losing that fragile connection entirely, and finding something far steadier in its place, for her to finally understand how little that old approval had ever actually mattered. Damien, for his part, remained a steady and constant presence throughout those weeks, though he was careful, in his own quiet way, never to push her toward anything faster than she was ready to accept. Their evenings together continued much as before, filled with easy conversation and comfortable silence, though something between them had shifted subtly since the conspiracy's resolution, deepening into something neither of them had yet spoken aloud. It was Damien who finally broke that silence, nearly 2 months after Elena's arrival at the palace, on a quiet evening in his mother's garden, the same place he had first shown her something true about himself, all those weeks earlier. "I have been considering how best to say this," he admitted, standing beside the fountain, the evening light casting long shadows across the gravel path. "I find, somewhat frustratingly, that clear words fail me more often than I would like to admit, when it comes to matters concerning you." Elena felt her heart quicken, though she said nothing, giving him the space to continue. "When I first saw you sitting alone at that ceremony," Damien said, "I told myself my actions were simply a matter of correcting an obvious wrong, and that was true. in part. But it was not the whole truth, even then. Something in the quiet dignity with which you carried that humiliation struck me deeply, and it has only grown clearer to me in the months since, through everything we have faced together, exactly how rare and how valuable that quality truly is. He turned to face her fully, his gray eyes steady despite the uncharacteristic uncertainty in his voice. I am not offering you a political arrangement, Elena, nor am I asking you to accept a position simply because circumstances have drawn us together. I am asking whether you would choose me, freely, of your own will, understanding fully everything that comes with such a choice, both its privileges and its burdens. Elena felt tears gather at the corners of her eyes, though this time, there was no doubt in her heart about what those tears meant. She had spent so much of her life being chosen for convenience, or not chosen at all, that the simple honesty of Damien's question, the genuine respect for her own agency woven through every word, meant more to her than any grand declaration could have. I choose this, she said softly, stepping closer to him. I choose you, not because you are the Alpha King, and not out of gratitude for everything you've done to protect me, but because somewhere between that first strange evening at the ceremony and this quiet garden tonight, I found something with you I never once believed I would find anywhere. Something that feels, for the first time in my life, entirely like home. Damien's expression softened into something Elena had rarely seen from him, an openness that felt like a gift freely given, rather than a mask carefully maintained. He reached out, gently cupping her face in his hands, and for a long moment, they simply stood together in the quiet evening light, the weight of everything they had endured finally settling into something steady and certain between them. The formal announcement came several weeks later, during the next great gathering of the territories, held in the very same grand hall where their story had first begun. Elena stood beside Damien at the head table this time, not as an unexpected guest drawing curious whispers, but as his chosen companion, acknowledged openly, before every ruling family gathered within those walls. She thought, as she looked out across the crowded hall, of the girl who had once sat alone at table 42, certain that she did not belong anywhere within these grand halls, convinced that her worth had been permanently defined by the family that had so easily set her aside. That girl felt distant now, a memory rather than a wound, though Elena understood she would always carry some piece of that experience within her, a reminder of exactly how far she had come. Near the end of the evening, as the formal proceedings gave way to quieter conversation among the gathered guests, Elena noticed a familiar figure standing near the edge of the hall. Vivian Voss, dressed carefully for the occasion, watched from a respectful distance, her expression difficult to read. Beside her stood Gerald, looking older somehow, and considerably more uncertain than Elena remembered. For a moment, old habits nearly pulled Elena toward the anxious deference she had spent years perfecting in that household, but Damien's steady presence beside her, and the quiet strength she had built for herself throughout the difficult months since the ceremony, held firm instead. She excused herself briefly and crossed the hall toward her former family, meeting Vivian's gaze with calm, even composure. I hope, Vivian said carefully, that there are no hard feelings between us, given everything that has happened. I don't hold anger toward you any longer, Elena said honestly, but I also won't pretend the past can simply be forgotten because circumstances have changed. I've built something new for myself here, something I intend to protect carefully, going forward. Vivian studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her eyes, before she finally gave a small, stiff nod. Then I wish you well, Elena, she said, and for once, there was no calculation hidden beneath the words, only something that might, if Elena allowed herself generous interpretation, have been genuine acknowledgement. Elena returned to Damien's side as the evening drew toward its close, and he reached for her hand, lacing his fingers gently through hers, the same steady gesture of quiet support he had offered so many times throughout the months since they had first met. Regretting anything? He asked softly, watching her expression as she glanced once more toward her departing family. No, Elena said, and found, as she said it, that the word carried complete and genuine certainty. For the first time in longer than I can remember, I don't regret anything at all. Outside, the night had grown clear and bright, Stars scattered generously across the dark sky above the palace grounds. Elena stood beside Damien near the tall windows of the grand hall, watching the last of the guests depart into the evening, feeling, at long last, the settled peace of having finally found exactly where she belonged. The girl who had once been left sitting alone, forgotten and overlooked, had become a woman chosen deliberately, valued openly, and loved without condition or hesitation. And as Damien drew her gently closer, resting his forehead lightly against hers in the quiet privacy of that fading evening, Elena understood, with complete and unwavering certainty, that whatever challenges still lay ahead in the years to come, she would never again have to face them sitting alone. She had found her place, at last, beside the king who had never once let her go.